Welcome to Empowered Life Hacks, where we share with you an explosion of tips to help you overcome your daily struggles. Pay attention for the audio and visual cues, and this will let you know when an actionable idea is right on its way.
Hello.
Everyone. Hey, Gennike's here, everyone, and we're at Empowered Life Hacks, and we had many guests, and we touched on many topics, and we went on this journey, and in this journey called life, we're going to come across people. So as you know, Empowered Life Hacks, we want to empower you with tips, actionable things to assess your situation and improve by doing the simple things. And sometimes the simple things can save you a lot of pain, a lot of heartache before it gets too bad. And Gennike offered to talk about a wonderful topic, right? How can we overcome dealing with people who can be manipulative, abusive, narcissistic? And we'll come across it at some point in our life. And if you get the particular person, can really make your life a very, very tough thing to deal with. And Gennike, I would love to just get into your story, your first experiences with maybe abusers, narcissists, and people maybe that are harmful, and how you overcame it. Like, where did it all start for you, your encounters with these types of people?
So let me first say, Eric, thank you for allowing me to speak about something that really is close to my heart, because all the titles that you spoke of earlier, I've encountered all of these. And I've been also accused of being some of those. Let me also just put a caveat here by saying I am not a psychologist or therapist. This is not my area of expertise per se. I am a human being, first of all. I'd like to say I'm privileged of having traveled the world for the purpose of work. And so I have met so many different people and personality types in different cultural settings that I feel like I've had this window to the world to be able to see human beings going about their business in all different settings. And I feel like I have a good understanding of these different personality types. And I've met them in work, in personal relations, in my family. And that's why I feel like I can speak about this today. So that's the caveat, right? But to your question, I guess the one thing that stands out for me particularly is those relationships in the field of work. Because let's face it, when we're born, we go to school, we do exams, we all push towards success, and everybody's dream is to either get a job or, own a business and employ people. We seem to be very much oriented towards the professional world. And so we spend a great portion of our life aiming for this job. And then when we get into a job setting, a job environment, we start to encounter all kinds of characters and people that school never taught us about. And I think one of your former guests touched on this, Reggie Waterman, because he intervenes in universities preparing young grads for the world of work. And one of the things he speaks about is, how do you deal with difficult people, difficult bosses, difficult colleagues? And so that's something that I've had to deal a lot with. And it's never easy, but it can be easier, one, if you know yourself well enough to know what your boundaries are, what kind of behavior you will tolerate from other people, and also how you will react when people start acting out at you. So it's always easy to blame somebody and say, well, this person said this and they were rude to me, or they insulted me, or they did this. But I like to look at myself first. Is there anything that I have said or done, or something I did not say or did not do, or the way in which I said it or did something that may have triggered a response? I think it starts with me, it starts with you, right? You ask yourself that question. Now, if you get to the understanding that, okay, you're actually really not at fault in there, then you can ask, okay, maybe what's triggering this person? Maybe there's something that they're dealing with that's manifesting in them being rude to you, or them trying to sabotage your work, or them, whatever the response might be. And I think that helps to separate yourself from the situation so that you don't end up being bitter in whatever the situation is, because it makes no sense. If one person is angry and lashing out, why are you going to allow that to fester in you and ruin your day or your disposition? So I think that's the place to start.
Interesting too, and starting with yourself. I love it because now, like, of course, Brene Brown had the idea of like vulnerability, right? And being like very overtly vulnerable to show people your authentic side, right? And I think the challenge with that is, though, I think people, if they don't look close to that, they won't necessarily see their boundaries. And I think you're tying in this other concept, Jocko Willink talks about extreme ownership. So it almost seems like there's balance between being vulnerable and authentic and then taking ownership. Like, so can you explain a process or a way of thinking or something actionable people can do to start looking at a situation, assess it, and then also asking themselves the questions to see, one, where they're at, and two, what they can do then or in the future to avoid a situation like that or to even get out of it?
So to answer your question, let's come back to that word you used about, well, two words, vulnerable and authentic. And these are buzzwords now: authentic leadership, being real, being vulnerable, especially in the digital context where we no longer have those face-to-face interactions and all the interactions are happening online. So there's like this really is a digital divide in that search for authenticity and vulnerability. But what can we do to action our, how should I say, manage our response to what's coming at us? What I have found useful for me is to acknowledge what's happening. And how do you do that? Somebody is saying something to me that I don't like. Maybe the person who is saying it with a particular intent, particular intention, in a particular tone that they don't even realize how it's sounding to somebody else, that somebody being me. I'm the one who is perceiving something that they're saying, and I'm the one who is not liking what they're saying. So here's what, I take ownership of what I'm hearing, and I feel authentic enough, real enough to say to that person, listen, you just said XYZ. I don't like your tone. Perhaps you could try saying it differently because this is what it sounds like to me. Now, that takes, again, self-knowledge. It also takes a level of boldness to be able to say, stop. I don't like this. It's no longer about you said this or you did this or you made me feel. No, you didn't make me feel anything. I feel this when you say this. So I take ownership of what I'm feeling. But I also feel free to say to the person, listen, this is how I feel when you say this in a particular way. Maybe you could try speaking in a different tone. Maybe you could try using different words, because that word you use there, it's quite, it's insulting or whatever have you. To make it very concrete, I'll take a real example. I've had to deal with office bullies, and quite frankly, it was very strange because I was the supervisor at the time, and the people bullying me were the people that I was supervising. So I found myself in this strange predicament of having to manage the relationship, manage these people, and at the end of the day, still try to get work done and deliver on what we had to do, right? So I felt this double responsibility of, one, having to set a good example because I was the supervisor, but two, as a manager, as a supervisor, to also impart to these persons that, listen, this is not acceptable behavior, not in an office environment, not in any environment. And so I had to take on that sort of coaching role to say, perhaps you can speak differently. Perhaps you could address me differently. Perhaps you could watch your tone. Perhaps you could knock on my door and ask to speak with me rather than sending off an email and copying 10 people in the office. So that for me is a very actionable thing. It links also to conflict resolution. And while I like to use office examples, conflict resolution, I think we all at some point have experienced this even in our personal relations, even between besties. Sometimes, your bestie, because your bestie is your bestie, that's your closest person, they're going to offend you at some point, or you're going to offend that person. So how do you deal with conflict when it's so, it's so near to your heart? Again, I think it's the same tactic, the same tool. You acknowledge what you're feeling. I feel hurt when you say this. I feel like you misunderstood me when you said this. So I take ownership. Starts with me. That's my actionable tip.
It's a very actionable tip, and it's a beautiful one. And I actually think it's great you're starting from an organizational standpoint, because I think often we look at families, friendships, business relationships, romantic relationships as like very different dynamics. And truthfully, maybe there is some, but the core fundamentals of how humans respond and react and how you go about that conflict is the same. And I like that if you start from you in every human relationship throughout all these settings, you can almost simplify the way you assess where you are, right? Rather than saying, I'm dealing with an office human, I'm dealing with a mom human, whatever, a friend. You look at it as I'm dealing with a human being, irrespective of the concept, and how are they making me feel, and how can we navigate this relationship? Of course, you have different objectives, but how would you, let's say, assess like the next appropriate action though afterwards? Because let's say they don't agree. Like I've had people not listen when I've gave my boundaries. And truthfully, I love that you said you've been labeled perhaps a narcissist or someone manipulative or someone doing something negative. Because I'll just say frankly, I'm not always a great person. And we all have these tendencies, even on the smallest level. So we have to learn to rid them in ourselves. But now we're just focusing on other people. What happens when people don't listen to us? Like what happens when Janika's like, hey, my foot's down. This is like the third time I've told you this. Why aren't you listening? I feel like striking you. I'm not going to because we're in an office, but what do you do in that? Like when you're like, oh my gosh, what do I do?
So yeah, I'm going to pull my hair out. Thank God.
Exactly.
Yes, if I pull it out, still be some left. But, it's funny because as you were just presenting that scenario, there's this quote that came to mind that narcissists feel disrespected when you don't allow them to disrespect you.
So perfect. I've never heard that.
I can't remember who said it, but it must have been floating around, I don't know, Facebook or LinkedIn or somewhere. But narcissists feel disrespected when you don't allow them to disrespect you. And so I have often found myself in a position where I've been accused of being disrespectful because I have enforced my boundaries. And, it hurts every time because my nature is to self-reflect first. That's my first point. So I keep having to come back to myself and say, but Gennike, did you really do this? Was that really the intention of your heart? Did it come out wrongly? Maybe in your heart it was a certain way, but by the time it got to your mouth and by the time it came out of your mouth, it came out in a skewed way that could have offended the person. But then once the answer to that question is no, this is not about me. This is that other person who is actually trying to manipulate the situation and throw it back at me. And that's what narcissists do. Now that's one thing. The other thing you were laying out in a scenario is these different types of relationships. And I guess the office relationship or the work relationship probably has very high stakes. And so it's a situation, at least for me, where I feel more inclined to find a peaceful resolution, because in the personal relationships, actually, I am far less tolerant. I'm far less tolerant, because very quickly I would say to myself and the people in my circle who, who've known me for a long time, they know my boundaries because I've been establishing those boundaries for a long time. And I guess the difference between that personal relationship versus the work relationship is that if you're dependent on a job, or if you enjoy your job, you enjoy the place where you work, you get along with most colleagues, but maybe there's just that one thorn who's sticking you in your side all the time, and you have to sort of weigh your options, like, okay, are you going to allow this one person to run you out of the ecosystem of work, because of their particular attitude or your interaction with that person? I think it may be far more difficult to do than maybe in personal relations. So for me, there's a distinction there. And what I have found, and again, I don't know if this is a particular personality type, maybe the HR professionals could weigh in on this. But I have found that when I am in an office environment, my role is often to bring to the surface anything that's troubling beneath. It just happens systematically. Wherever I go, things could be going very well, but there's always going to be some situation that needs light shed on it. And because of my nature, it's going to come to the surface and it needs to be dealt with. And I tend to deal with these things head on. And head on means acknowledging that it exists. A lot of people just try to ignore, some people, you just don't want to have to deal with a difficult situation. You don't want to have those difficult conversations. And so you pretend that it doesn't exist, and you just, try to just get your job done in your little corner and forget about the things that are actually impacting on your ability to get your job done properly. So I think it's important to acknowledge that, particularly in the workplace, because at the end of the day, people are in business for what? To deliver services, to make products, and at the end of the day, to make money. That's how the economy runs. So when you have these interpersonal relationships in the work environment that could impact on your bottom line, the boss is not going to have it. You got to sort out your issues, whatever they are, whether it's between boss and supervisee and supervisor, or pairs, or whatever have you got to sort it out. And if you're unable to sort it out between yourselves, then the next level is mediation. Now, that's also a process that I've been through. And again, it's I take it as a self-reflection, first of all, that I agree to go through a mediation process with the help of a professional. Some companies have mediators as part of their team. Usually it's in the HR department. Sometimes an external mediator would be brought in to try to resolve a situation that is going on. And that was the case with me twice. I've been through 2 mediation processes in places where I've worked before. And I'm always happy to go through the process, because I think at the end of this process, something good is going to come out of it. I'm going to learn something about myself. I'm probably going to learn an additional skill that I need to learn. And hopefully the problem would have been resolved at some point. That's usually my hope. But not everybody sees mediation in that way. Some people take it as a threat. Some people actually see it, get very defensive about, well, why do I need mediation? Why can't we sort this out between ourselves? Why do we have to bring somebody in to tell us what to do? Well, that's just how human beings are.
And it's actually a great process. I don't know if you noticed it, but first one is just admitting, because do you know what I think people get really deep because they don't want to admit that they have to do something. It's more daunting to confront someone than not confront someone. Of course, being truthful and immediate action, like taking action immediately, will stop long-term harm. I heard that from Jordan Peterson, but he's like, but it's easier to lie, and it's much harder to assess the situation truly. So we lie to ourselves in these situations. Well, it's not that bad.
Absolutely.
What you said is we be honest with ourselves and we say, is this where I'm at? Once you agreeance on this, and I'm talking about worst case scenario, Gennike, me, you gave every boundary in the book. So you be
Yeah.
honest with yourself in that point. Then you mentioned there's this remediation process. Now, remediation can be something obviously within an organization, right? That has to happen, but it can happen in our own lives. And I'm curious, like, what's that remediation process like? Because whether at home, of course, you can be more free and you don't have to see the person every day. You know, you can go for a walk if it's your friend. But I'm wondering, is there similarities that you can tell people to do a remediation process either in the organization or at their home? And if there's a difference, can you share actionable tips to go about the remediation process for on the personal side and the organizational side?
Sure. And let's just be clear, again, it is easier to lie to yourself and tell yourself, this is not a real problem. This doesn't really exist. I'm fine. I think that's a lie we tell ourselves. I'm fine. This doesn't hurt me. I can do without this person in my life. I can do without this situation in my life. And I've told myself that a few times, but I don't have the benefit, unfortunately, of being able to sleep at night when I'm lying to myself. And so it will literally prevent me from sleeping. And so that's something that has pushed me, has forced me to take ownership quickly, acknowledge that this is a real situation. This situation needs to be resolved. I am going to do whatever I can to resolve the situation. But if I have done what I can, and if I have done what I feel is enough, and there's not that other person not meeting me halfway, then I can also decide I'm going to walk away from this. And that is a very personal situation, in that I have walked away from marriage. I have walked away from long-standing, personal relationships, when it got to the point that over years, and this, it's difficult for me to tell, but I shared, one of my best friends, we've been there for each other for years and years through some really, really tough times. But there was just one matter on which we could not agree on how we saw that particular matter. And it really started to fester, and it got to the point where she no longer wanted to see me. I no longer wanted to hear from her. I was living in another country, but when I would visit Trinidad and Tobago, I would call and I'd listen, I'm here for a week, I'd like to see you. She would say stuff like, well, I have laundry to do, so I'm busy. And I thought, well, listen, I'm only here for a week. I'm living overseas. I'm here for a week. I want to make time for you, and you're telling me about your laundry. That made me feel like, okay, your laundry is more important than I am. Okay. I take that to mean what it means. You're not willing to kind of work on this relationship in the current state. And, a few years later, we just, we drifted apart. I can't say there's no hard feelings, there's no hatred, there's no animosity or anything like that, but the relationship just, it just crumbled, and we've not spoken to each other. Now, but there was a process. The process lasted years until it got to the point where clearly the relationship was not valued enough by either of us that we were willing to patch it together, and we just both let it go, and that's where it is. So, there could be many different outcomes of a mediation process. You could actually enter into mediation and get to a point where you say, this is not worth it. I'm not willing to give more of myself to make this work. And I can only speak for myself. I have gotten to that point where I've walked away because at some point I said, look, this is not worth my energy. It's not worth my time. It's not worth my sanity to try to pursue this. You are who you are. I am who I am. Let's just keep it apart for your sake and for my sake. And then you move on and you learn the lesson. And that's where, to come back to the top of the program, there are signs. And I guess one of the advantages of having a few difficult relationships, whether at work or, you know, in your personal life, is that after a while you start to see a pattern, and you can, if you're paying attention, you can pick up on the signs, and you can more or less make a rule that says, okay, if I see the sign, or if I see the sign and it adds up to this and it adds up to this, maybe I need to be careful here. Now, you also need to be careful in applying the rule because everybody's different, but I think it also helps you to have those difficult conversations early on. Like if you see signs that you've seen in a previous relationship popping up, then you can say, hey, listen, I want to talk to you about this thing that I noticed about you. You said this or you did this. What do you mean by this? Because you see, I've had some past experiences where somebody said this and they did this and this is what it meant. Is it the same meaning with you? Or is it something different? You can actually speak about it more openly and honestly and early, before it gets too late, before it starts to fester, before it really hurts you or hurts the other person. So I think that's the benefit of having fallen a few times, gotten up, you know, shaken off the dust, and then you get going again.
Yeah, it's true. You start seeing patterns, and I like what you said. Like everyone, they're obviously a clear sign you're dealing with someone who may be taking advantage of you or could hurt you is that you're setting boundaries and they're not listening. I think that's the clearest one. Or you're just being taken advantage of and you're just saying yes. You're not even realizing you should have a boundary there, and before you know it, you realize you never created a boundary for this thing that you should have had a boundary, and now you have to even learn about your boundaries. So the idea is preventatively create the boundaries, and then if you're already too deep, assess those signs and monitor those signs and pen them down and say, when I see this, I have to at least have a rule. And I like what you said about not having too hard of a fast rule and then addressing it, because the last thing you want to do is when someone's just having a bad day or has problem articulating themselves in a certain way that they're trying to manipulate you. Maybe, but also maybe not. Maybe it's just a harmless way they go about themselves. And if you check them, they'll be more cognizant of their nature, and then they won't do that to you again. Or if they do, you'll have an easy conversation saying, hey, you're doing that thing again that I told you makes me uncomfortable. Now, you talked about it from like an organizational standpoint. I was curious, like, what does that look like for someone? Let's say someone's at an organization, they love their job, they love their role, and they don't want to leave their organization because they actually need that experience up the ladder. You know how that is. New organization, you don't want to build all that rapport, then leave it. What does someone do right when their boundaries are crossed? Like what is that process like? And how do they stay at that job? And also, when do they decide to leave and just say, it's not worth my time?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Eric. And again, I share from a very personal place. I had that experience where I now have changed jobs quite frequently just because, you know, opportunities came up and I felt like there was more potential for growth in what I was going to. And so I've left organizations because I felt I could grow elsewhere. But there was one organization that I joined where I actually said out loud, and I said it to myself, and I was overjoyed. And I said, you know, I can see myself retiring here. Now, that's the first time in my life I had ever heard myself say that, because I'm formatted in such a way that, you know, I'm ready to move when the wind blows. But I said it out that I could see myself retiring here. And little had I said that, that's when I started being tested. My patience started being tested. And that was the office bullies scenario that I mentioned earlier. Now, what happened there was that there was actually history before I came on board in my particular position, that it had been known to all and sundry that there was a high turnover in my position. And it felt almost like everybody was looking on to see, well, how long is she going to last in that job? Because everybody knows that, you know, the doors turn very quickly in that particular position. And so I came in with that knowledge. I had been warned ahead of time. And that actually inspired me to say, you know what? I'm going to be the last one in this position. I am going to be the one who makes it through, who sticks with it, I'm going to change things. And I did try. And because I had been alerted, I think I was better equipped to deal with what was coming at me. However, I still did make the decision for myself at some point after having flagged what I thought was of concern to me, after having had one-on-one meetings, after having requested intervention of the director, after having gone through a mediation process that lasted for 3 months.
Wow.
After that process, when I had not seen any changes in the other person, and I'm authentic. I know I had changed. I had changed a lot. I had softened up quite a bit, coming out of that mediation process. I had even a checklist that was stuck on my computer of, things I need to be mindful of in dealing with that particular person. And I went through all of that. I know I gave my 100%, but I still ended up making a decision to leave because I felt like there was no change on the other side. And what I did in that situation, this is what I would advise anyone, albeit all organizations are different, but in that particular organization, there was a formal complaint process. And so I lodged a report. I resigned. I did not give a sort of flimsy diplomatic resignation. No, I went into great detail, respectfully, but I did not cover the truth. And I explained exactly why I resigned, because of this history that I had been through, which had traumatized me, quite frankly, and that I felt that I did not want to remain in a toxic environment, and that I was, in my resignation, inviting the directorate to please urgently address what I felt was a burning issue in the organization. Now, that in itself is risky. Let me say this, because potentially I could have eliminated myself from working in other branches of that organization. It's an international organization. And so I ran the risk of locking myself out of any future opportunities with the organization. And perhaps those doors are closed to me today. I don't even know. But I'm saying this because it's a big decision that you would have to make at some point. Now, you might decide you're going to stick with it. You're going to find it within yourself to stick with it. Maybe you're not going to change the world. Maybe you're not going to change the other person, but you're going to change yourself and how you deal with the situation. But for me, I decided that enough was enough, and I was not prepared to. At that point, it felt like I would be pretending that things were getting better when they actually weren't. And so I flagged it. I put in a report with my resignation, and I know that there was an investigation done after my departure. Now, I say this because some people have that mantle or that mandate, and it is to be a change agent. Sometimes you can change things from inside the organization. Sometimes you change it from outside of the organization. And I am happy to say that years later, I did get some feedback kind of through the grapevine that report that I put in and my resignation, because nobody else had ever resigned in that way, taking the time to write real reasons for resigning. And I was told that, that did force some serious change management, not just for the few persons involved, but for the entire office. It was recognized that perhaps it was time for the entire office to face up to some realities. And so that there was a, like a leadership retreat afterward. And this is years after I left. But I was told that it was connected to what I had written in my resignation and my report. So it was a tough decision, but I don't regret it. I have since moved on, and I'm happy to hear that it seems that there have been some changes within the organization, thanks to documenting what I felt was a very dangerous and toxic environment.
That was a beautiful example, because really, like, we have the whole process of having your boundaries, and then if you don't have boundaries, or if you do, at one point you have to be honest with yourself. Once you're honest with yourself, you have that remediation process. It's a questioning process, and you contemplate and say, how can we make this work? If that doesn't work, you're only suffering, and you could be lying to yourself again after that, thinking it's going to get better. But the walking away portion, and not just walking away, at times being vocal. And as you said, you have to, I think as people, we have to understand we can make a difference, we can make a change. Is us being vocal going to harm us more than it's going to help other people? And if
It,
no, maybe it's worth saying it, right? Because Janika, I'll tell you this, even if you, let's say you, regardless of what happened there, worst case scenario, you couldn't work at that organization. But that could be great context for another interview of how strong and resilient you are as a person, right? So I honestly think, had you not said anything, that trajectory for that organization, toxic cultures just get more toxic. That's just the truth of it. So really, you gave a real concrete example for people for how to assess their situation. Um, Now, we covered a lot today, and I didn't want to overwhelm the listeners too much, so I'll be documenting all this stuff and very actionable tips. Janika shared a lot today, but I'm curious, Janika, what would you like to impart as a last piece of wisdom or tip or idea that people can hold close to them? Just a simple thing, even though simplicity can be hard. What is one thing you can give people that they can hold close as they navigate relationships and deal with such people?
so it's a word that I learned in 2017. It's called gaslighting. I never knew the existence of that word before. And I discovered the existence of that word in my work life and in my personal life at the same time. So um, you can go Google it, ask Uncle Google, but it's basically manipulation. It's a form of manipulation where the manipulator is so skilled that the person gets you to start doubting your own thoughts, your own words, your own actions. And I would say that having discovered that word, that label, it has made me much more aware of how other people can very quietly plant seeds of doubt in your mind. And from the moment I saw the description, the meaning of the word, I realized, wow, I have actually been exposed to gaslighting, and I have unwittingly allowed this person to plant these seeds of doubt in my mind over my own words. So my advice and bit of wisdom coming out of this piece of vocabulary that I learned is to really, on a daily basis, really make it a daily habit of who am I and who am I wanting to be today. Now, this doesn't mean that you're schizophrenic. It just means that if you're in a process of seeking to better yourself daily, every day I just want to be a better version of me. I don't want to be better than you. I don't want to be like anybody else. I just want to be a better version of me. And so if that is my goal, and if I am in a daily process to become that better version of me, it's like in the garden, and I love to bring everything back to the garden. It's like weeding daily. If a week goes by or 2 weeks go by and it's rained a lot, you're gonna have weeds everywhere in your, and the day you go, you make time to go weed up those weeds, it's gonna be overwhelming for you. You're not gonna be able to pluck up every single weed. But if every day, little by little, you pluck out one little weed, two little weeds here and there, it will never multiply. It will never overwhelm your garden. And it's the same thing for life. It's the same thing for your mindset. Don't allow people to plant those seeds, those weeds, particularly of doubt, where you get to the point of you doubting your own self. You're doubting your own intentions. That is dangerous. And so that's my final words of wisdom. Take care of your garden. Pluck out those weeds as soon as you see them. Don't let them overwhelm the garden of your mind.
That was a beautiful summary. I couldn't have asked or could have imagined a better conclusion to the episode, honestly. So, everyone, thanks so much for tuning in. We have a few episodes left here, and we're going to be bridging all this gap. And Janika, thanks so much for giving us all these tools to help us overcome ourselves first, of course, and then manage other people. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good one. Bye,
You.
everyone.
Bye.
everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for our 10th episode of our Empowered Life Hacks Talk series. We really covered a wider range of topics, ranging from a lot of things like trying to make boring things more fun, overcoming instant gratification, developing your own superpowers, developing a personal brand. But of course, along that way, you're going to be dealing with people. And Gennike right now covered a whole bunch of skill sets, methods for assessing, is someone abusing me, taking advantage of me? How do I go about this process and attack it? And when enough is enough, what do I do, right? Now that we have that down, I thought, what better way to close off our season for season 1, providing you a holistic set of tools and tips that you can apply in your life. Why not cover it with relationships, right? Romantic relationships, partnerships with someone whom you want to spend the rest of your life with, or a long time with. And I brought in Nick and Jessica Benson. They had 2 episodes already, and they're coming together and talking about some actionable things they do to make sure their finances are great, their romance is on point, their career's on fleek, and everything's just going great for them. So I can't wait for y'all to check them out and check out our last episode and how to develop a really strong partnership with another human being. So I appreciate y'all. Thank you so much for tuning in, and chat soon. Peace.